According to your one weirdo uncle, sex, drugs, and rock and roll were all invented in the 1960s. Now, ex hippie nostalgia aside, the 60s were a very tumultuous time in our national history. You had huge, sweeping social and cultural changes, and the genre would reflect this. And in fact, the genre actually influenced some of these changes. Heck, Frodo Lives became sort of a counterculture slogan of the time. And all of these changes to the genre went on to become known as the New Wave. So there's New Wave cinema, which started in France in the late 50s, and New Wave music, which is all about keytars and electronica, and that's from the 80s. And so in between, you have New Wave science fiction. I guess it's sort of a migratory term. Now, New Wave sci-fi was a reaction to the hard sci-fi of the Golden Age. In fact, the term soft science fiction was used a lot to describe this kind of science fiction before they started using the term new wave in the 1970s. Now, to make a sweeping generalization, soft science fiction doesn't focus on the technology rather than focusing on the people who use the technology. For example, in Frank Herbert's classic Dune, space travel and technology is all kind of mysterious, almost mystical. Instead, he's focusing on the culture and politics of a far future human empire. And heck, the use of the spice as a experience enhancing, mind changing kind of drug goes in line with the whole general experimental nature of the 1960s. Now, the Cold War also influenced the genre, especially when the Cold War turned hot. Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers pretty much defined military science fiction as a subgenre, and then authors such as David Drake or Joel Haldeman would use their experiences from Vietnam to inform their own military sci-fi, which has built up into its own little subgenre that is mostly published by Baen Books, but I digress. Now, while this is a primarily a book-focused YouTube channel, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the biggest works in the genre to come out of the 60s, Star Trek. Star Trek has lasted for decades, and for good reason. It's a combination of space opera adventure with social commentary, and, I mean, for example, the first interracial kiss on television was between, Kirk and Uhura, so good for all you shippers, even though I think she likes Sulu better. Now, Star Trek wasn't the first work to make sci fi sexy. I mean, there were, of course, the covers of the pulp magazines, but things went farther than that. Philip Jose Farmer is widely credited with bringing explicit sexuality into the genre with his 1950 story, The Lovers. Now, more authors would follow Farmer's lead. For example, Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land used the conceit of a human raised on Mars to explore Earth, and then use that to explore themes such as religion and capitalism and sexuality from the perspective of an outsider. And again, this iconoclastic novel was soon picked up by the counterculture, and I mean, the term grok became part of their lingo. Now, in a less lofty example of sex in science fiction, you have John Norman's Gore novels, and they started as derivative planetary romance, which is pretty much swords and sorcery in space, but as they went on, they kind of went more into like this weirdo, kinky bondage territory. I mean, just compare this first edition cover to this 2007 edition cover. Yeah. So it's also worth noting that Norman's Gore novels aren't particularly good or influential, but I just find that whole combination of sex and science fiction kind of funny. Heck, even Isaac Asimov played around with some of these ideas. In his novel The Gods Themselves, he writes about an alien race with three genders, as well as the difficulties of having sex in the moon's microgravity. Speaking of sex and gender, bad segue, many more women started writing in the genre during the new wave. Now, women had been writing science fiction ever since Mary Shelley, but the 60s and 70s are when we really begin to see more and more writers emerge. For example, Anne McCaffrey combined science fiction and fantasy with her Pern novels, or Octavia Butler would address themes of race with her Patternist novels, and Ursula K. Le Guin would examine gender in works like The Left Hand of Darkness. And all of these works are still worth reading, still very relevant today. The 60s and 70s are really when the genre started to grow into what we read, what we watch, and what we even play in video games today. I know I've missed a ton of important works and a ton of important writers, but again, I'm only trying to put this down into a couple of minutes. But there was one work in particular that came out in 1974 that would go on to influence the genre for years and years to come. And that work is Dungeons and Dragons. No, really. I'll tell you more about it next week.